Welcome to April. It's really, really hot. And honestly, the hottest and most expensive asset right now has to be oil prices. Nothing else comes close. Hello, welcome to Money Monitor. It's Sai here with you again. Today, we're going to talk about oil prices because right now, crude oil prices it's already at $85, $86 per barrel, right? That's really high because back in December, it actually dropped as low as around $68 per barrel. So what happened is OPEC Plus, right? They pressured oil prices by cutting oil production, didn't they? The idea was to reduce the global oil supply so that oil prices would go up. And they actually succeeded in doing that. OPEC Plus has been cutting global oil production since 2022, and up until now, the average cut is about 5.86 million barrels per day. So this 5.86 million barrels per day, how much is that exactly? Did you know that this accounts for 5.7% of the world's oil demand? Or in technical terms, it's 5.7% of global demand. And when they cut oil by 5.7%, oil prices shot up by 20%. Like I mentioned before, back on December 2nd, 2023, the price was around $68 per barrel. Today, it's gone up to about $84 or $85 per barrel, I think. $1 per barrel. Which means that OPEC Plus has an immense amount of influence. They have the significant regulatory authority to order cuts in oil production, which means they can effectively determine which direction oil prices should go, whether they should rise or fall. And those who have the power to set oil prices essentially and fundamentally have the power to determine the fate of the global economy. And this power becomes even clearer when you look at the data presented in this specific graph. This is a graph showing the global oil trade surplus and deficit. Now, as you can clearly see here, Bloomberg reported that these numbers fluctuate depending on whether OPEC Plus announces significant cuts in their production or not. So it's obvious that our world, if you ask whether the world relies more on money or oil, I think what the world truly needs, what the economy really needs, is oil more than money. Not so much the money, but let me explain that. Besides the significant power to manage and control oil, the Russian Federation. Let's save that for the next episode. What they're trying to do now is control food prices as well. So why are they holding back? Now, for anyone investing in oil prices, whether you want to buy oil stocks directly or whatever else, you probably want to know, hey, is the price of oil likely to go up from here? We need to look at the factors, right? One factor I want you to pay attention to is OPEC Plus has the power to decide whether to cut or not cut oil production in order to influence whether oil prices should be high or low, right? So let's take a look at who's the big player in OPEC Plus. That would be Saudi Arabia, followed by Russia. Right now, both of these countries have reasons to want to push oil prices even higher. Starting with Saudi Arabia, this year, they're forecasting that in 2024, Saudi Arabia's trade ran a deficit of 79 billion rials, which, if converted to US dollars, is about $23 billion. This is because Saudi Arabia is currently in the midst of an economic transition. They're spending a lot of money, even though they're selling a huge amount of oil. As a result, this past January, Saudi Arabia had to borrow money. The classic way to do that is by selling Saudi government bonds. The government bonds that Saudi Arabia sold, they sold them off. And they were able to borrow at pretty high interest rates. As you can see here, it was in the high 4s, almost 5%, and in the high 5s, nearly 6%. Those are pretty steep interest rates, but that's because inflation is really high this year, right? But like I said, since Saudi Arabia is the #1 in OPEC Plus, they have power. The power to control oil prices, to raise or lower them. their country produces a huge amount of oil, so Saudi Arabia has options when it comes to raising money. Instead of having to borrow new money to pay off old debt like other countries have to do, Saudi Arabia can just make oil prices go up and increase their revenue. They can set oil prices just like that. I wouldn't have to borrow that much, and I'd also have more income. But here's the thing, you have to be careful, because if oil prices get too high, history has shown that when oil prices are unreasonably high, global demand for oil drops, and then it's possible that the oil just won't sell. Now, second is Russia. Of course, everyone knows that right now, Russia needs money to fund the war, right? And Russia's main source of income definitely comes from selling oil. So producing oil to drive up oil prices is definitely a positive for Russia because they'll be able to sell at higher prices. Right now, Russia has to lower the price of oil it sells to China. But if it's other regions, they might not have to discount it that much. The reason they have to rely on China is because at the moment, China is Russia's #1 oil buyer. About 19% of China's oil comes from Russia. Oh, and like I mentioned before, because China and India are getting cheap oil from Russia. So right now, in terms of trade and global competition, China and India have a significant advantage. China can produce goods at a lower cost than other countries because oil is a fundamental cost for manufacturing, transportation, and every industry. And China is getting cheap oil from Russia, while European countries right now, you could even say they're in trouble. For example, let me explain first. If you remember, ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States imposed sanctions, and as a result, Europe got cut off from cheap oil from Russia. There was that pipeline under the sea. I can't remember the name. If anyone remembers, leave a comment. That got cut off. And even now, there's still a dispute over who actually blew up that pipeline, sending oil from Russia to Europe. Whoever benefited from it is probably the one behind it then. That's why countries in Europe, like the UK, Britain, right now have officially entered a recession because their GDP has been negative for 2 consecutive quarters. And Germany, which is another major economy in Europe, has already entered a recession since the beginning of the year. The trend for Germany's GDP is only going down, and it looks like it will keep declining because Germany is a country that relies heavily on industrial production and exports. Right? Made in Germany, like Benz, BMW, Volvo. If we're going to talk about Germany, that would have to be a whole separate episode because that's a heavy topic too. Now, some people have asked, hey, why do we let OPEC Plus, which is led by Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other Arab countries, be the ones to set oil prices? Because actually, the United States is the country that produces the most oil in the world. Well, that's because OPEC Plus is made up of a lot of major influential regional players, right? Together, they produce roughly 26% of the world's total oil demand. Meanwhile, the US doesn't actually produce quite that much on its own. But then people often ask, so why don't European countries and the US just use oil produced right here in America? Well, they do use it, so let's take a look. The price of oil produced in America. It's already expensive, and now it's getting even more expensive because just this past January, there was a report saying that even oil produced in the United States has dropped by as much as 6% due to the unpredictable and especially harsh cold weather. So to sum it all up, there are a number of significant factors supporting the rise in oil prices. As I mentioned, Saudi Arabia is actively seeking to drive global oil prices higher, and Russia also wants much higher oil prices so they can continue financing their ongoing military operations, right? And right now, the current geopolitics are becoming pretty intense. If the conflict escalates even more and starts to significantly disrupt international oil production, it will inevitably push oil prices even higher than they are right now. Earlier, Ukraine deployed a fleet of drones to attack Russian oil refineries. On the day of the attack, around March 12th, as soon as Ukraine's drones hit Russia, oil prices instantly surged upward by 4%. This shows that Russian oil production is both incredibly massive and extremely important to the world. Bloomberg also reported that JP Morgan has officially issued a stark warning that there is a possibility that in 2024, crude oil prices might reach 3 digits, that is $100 per barrel. Now, this tells us that if oil prices get this expensive, inflation will be hard to bring down. When oil prices go up, transportation costs rise, and import and export costs become more expensive. Shipping rates go up, right? Because ships need oil, and domestic transportation costs also increase. The cost of manufacturing goods in the country also goes up, which makes food more expensive, energy more expensive, and makes it harder for inflation to come down. Now, another thing we need to keep an eye on is not just wondering how high oil prices can go, but also questioning whether the Fed, which previously said it would cut interest rates, will actually be able to do so, because this is a major factor that will determine the value of assets or which direction the economy will go. Stay tuned for more updates on income with Money Monster. Thank you.